Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies' first academic event in this 2022 fall session. My name is Nuruddin Jabnoon. I am faculty member at the CCAS. I am delighted and honored to be joined by Ian Martin, who will discuss his recent book, All Necessary Measures, the United Nations and International Intervention in Libya, published in April of this year by Hearst. In his book, Ian Martin discusses the international intervention after the 2011 Libyan uprising against Muammar al-Gaddafi and offers his perspective on what happened in this country when, amid the highest critical time of the wave of the Arab uprisings across the region, the UN authorized a multi-state NATO-led military intervention, and how this intervention under the banner of the so-called responsibility to protect evolved into a NATO-backed regime change, and how it created the conditions that quickly turned Libya into a bloody civil war. 10 years after this intervention, the situation in Libya remains volatile, with a new political class and its allied non-state armed groups and militias vying for power and resources, while Libya is coping with a stranded transition since 2011. All Necessary Measures is a sober and reliable critic of what became quote-unquote mission creep, and a must-read to better understand what led to the unfolding tragedy that Libya is still experiencing as I speak. Ian Martin led United Nations field missions in several countries, including as first special representative of the Secretary General and head of the UN support mission in Libya, UNSMIL, from 2011 to 2012, special representative of the Secretary General in Nepal from 2005 to 2009, and special representative of the Secretary General for the East Timor Popular Consultation in 1999. He also served as head of the UN Headquarters Board of Inquiry into certain incidents in the Gaza Strip, representative in Nepal of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in the UN mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea, Chief of the UN Human Rights Field Operation in Rwanda, and Director for Human Rights of the UN and the Organization of American States International Civilian Mission in Haiti. Ian Martin was from 1996 to 1992 Secretary General of Amnesty International, Vice President of the International Center for Transitional Justice from 2002 to 2005, and from 2015 to 2018, Executive Director of Security Council Report. His writings include Self-Determination in East Timor, the United Nations, the Ballot and International Intervention, published by Lenny Rayner in 2001, and All Necessary Measures, the United Nations and International Intervention in Libya, a book that our guest speaker will discuss this evening. I must add one very important element that is missing from Ian Martin's bio, which I think needs to be emphasized. Ian Martin opposed to the illegal intervention and war on Iraq in 2003 and resigned his long-standing membership as the Labour Party when the then Prime Minister Tony Blair partnered with President Bush in invading and occupying Iraq, with all the devastating consequences that followed, which this country is still enduring today. Over the next perhaps 45 minutes or so, I will engage in a conversation with our guest speaker about his book, followed by 15 minutes during which our guest speaker will address some questions from the audience. That being said, Ian Martin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the CCAS, though remotely. I would like to open up our conversation by asking you my first question. You wrote about these events almost 10 years after they took place. Why now? What are some of the rationales behind writing this book? In other words, why did you write this book?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I think there were two main reasons. I left Libya after the July 2012 election at a time that was still relatively optimistic. I mean, in fact, shortly before I left, the US ambassador, Chris Stevens, died in the attack on the US compound in Benghazi. And of course, there were many other signs of the difficulties of the transition. But nonetheless, there was hope that a rather good election producing a General National Congress could be the basis for a more effective government going forward that could address the problems of the proliferation and armed groups and other key challenges. Well, 10 years later, although I continued to a limited extent to follow Libya, things have been more than volatile, the adjective that you use. And so I did feel that I needed to ask myself whether there were things that I was responsible for in that early period that could have been done differently or better, that would have perhaps helped head off some of the difficulties that lay ahead. The second reason is that, frankly, I got increasingly irritated with some of the references to Libya in 2011, 2012 that I think really miss or distort a lot of the realities of that time. I mean, I saw something the other day that referred to the US-led invasion of Libya. Well, that's not exactly what I remember happening. And I think however one judges in retrospect the intervention itself and how it unfolded, I think the story is a more complicated one than often superficial references to it today, and one that needs to be better understood. So those are the two main reasons. I could only add that I needed something to do during the lockdowns of COVID in London, which gave me time perhaps to dig in more deeply than I might otherwise have done.
Now, about the title of your book, why did you choose this title, All Necessary Measures with question mark means?
Well, all necessary measures is the language that the United Nations Security uses when it authorizes use of force, military action, not just in Libya. I mean, it is the language of the Security Council Resolution 1973 that authorized the Libya military action, but it's been used in many previous cases. But the question mark to which you rightly draw attention is important, because it seemed to me that it asks a number of questions. One is whether the original intervention was necessary. Was it justified in terms of protecting civilians? Secondly, was the way it was carried out in practice what was necessary? Thirdly, was all that might have been done necessarily to bring about a managed transition and a peaceful end to the conflict done? And finally, the famous remark of former President Obama that he justified the intervention, but not preparing for the day after was the worst mistake of his presidency. Well, part of my United Nations responsibility was to think about the United Nations role afterwards. So was all that was necessary done to think about what followed? So insofar as one can capture a number of the themes of a book in the title, I thought to some extent that perhaps did it.
So I want to go to this resolution 1973 that excluded the deployment of any foreign occupation forces, though it did allow the use of all necessary measures and was vague enough to prevent superpowers like China and Russia from vetoing it. What's your interpretation of the UN resolution 1973 in terms of authorization of the use of force, while there is neither reference to the party that should implement it, nor the level of engagement and the scale of the force itself?
Well, again, one has to say that isn't unique, that previous UN authorizations of military interventions had similarly only given very general authority without spelling out by whom or exactly in what way that authority was going to be exercised. And retrospectively, it's clearly the case that if members of the Security Council had known the way that the military intervention was going to unfold, I don't think it wouldn't have had 9 votes in the Security Council, let alone the withholding of negative votes or possible vetoes by Russia and China. And there are important lessons for those of us concerned with the health of the United Nations as to the accountability back to the Security Council when the Security Council authorizes the use of force. There were reporting obligations in theory on those that purported to act under the terms of the resolution, and NATO dutifully did file reports, although bilateral actors who put their special forces on the ground didn't report what they were doing. And there were ambiguities in the resolution, for example, whether the arms embargo that had already been imposed on Libya was or wasn't overridden by the all necessary measures in the resolution. And some members of the council complained at the time, those who abstained, not only Russia and China, but India, Brazil, were concerned that it was already a blank check. So there's no question that in retrospect there was not real accountability of those who claimed they were acting under the authority of the resolution back to the UN Security Council. And the consequence of that is that I don't think one can conceive of similar authorization today. Of course, already discussions in the UN Security Council about intervening in Syria were very much colored by the Libya experience.
Okay. From the perspective of many, I would say, people who are working on the region and Libya, Libya served as another experiment to implement the responsibility to protect doctrine that was adopted by the UN General Assembly at the 2005 World Summit. What did the responsibility to protect, why did this responsibility to protect fail? That's when we talk about imposing no-fly zone and authorizing protection of civilian population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity as a pretext for regime change. So was there a real case of intervention in Libya in line with these 4 crimes mentioned in the paragraphs 138 and 139 of the 2005 World Summit outcome document? And did NATO exceed its mandates as claims of genocide seems in retrospect widely exaggerated?
That's a very big question. Let me unpack it a bit. I mean, there are books, whole books, and many articles now written about Libya in relation to R2P, responsibility to protect.
Yeah.
And the first thing is, I don't myself believe that the Libya intervention came about because the UN General Assembly had adopted the doctrine of responsibility to protect. Where that doctrine came from was the experience in particular of Rwanda and Bosnia, and people saying never again must there be humanitarian tragedies like that without intervention. That led to a lot of discussion that eventually was codified in R2P. Now, the Libya intervention and the decisions of the policymakers were certainly very much influenced by Rwanda and Bosnia, and the policymakers included people who had been involved in that and were very concerned that they were not going to sit by and be held responsible for a new Rwanda or a new Srebrenica on their watch. But personally, I think that influence would always have been there. I don't think the fact that in the meantime it had been codified in the R2P doctrine made a great deal of difference to the decisions that were made. second part of the question is, was there a real threat of the kinds of major crimes that are defined in R2P, and indeed, as you say, and as I say in the book, there was significant exaggeration. I don't think genocide was ever an appropriate term to use in the context of what was happening in Libya, although I do think I certainly think there were crimes against humanity committed by the Gaddafi regime in response to the uprising, and after looking pretty carefully at the evidence, I do think that something very nasty would have happened in Benghazi if Gaddafi's retaking of Benghazi had gone ahead. So I do think there was an initial case for intervention to check Gaddafi's attack on Benghazi and retaking of other cities that had fallen into rebel hands. But I do also believe, as your question implies, that what began with a mandate to protect civilians did become regime change. It's not easy to define, exactly where that line was crossed, because if you have a regime that is acting in a way that involves the killing and attacks on civilians, to what extent are you justified in, as people say, degrading its ability to do that? And it was clear the council authorization wasn't just about a no-fly zone. It was also about, and the then US permanent representative at the time, Susan Rice, told the Security Council very clearly that the authorization was going to include attacks on Gaddafi's ground forces as they advanced on Benghazi. But from the beginning, the scale of the operation in attacking what NATO called command and control centers anywhere in the country, in the west of the country, rapidly became controversial. And I do believe myself that it became a regime change operation, which some of the interveners justified by saying, as long as Gaddafi remained in charge, civilians in Libya were not safe from him and his forces. But to take that to the extreme of further NATO action in relation to the last Gaddafi strongholds of Sirte and Bani Walid, when he'd already fled Tripoli, that I think is to stretch a mandate to protect civilians to lengths that can't be defended.
Yeah, I think from the inception of the Libyan crisis, Britain and particularly France seemed determined to overthrow Gaddafi and not interested in finding a diplomatic and peaceful solution to what started as a peaceful uprising and ended up quickly or turned into an armed rebellion. And you reflected in your book on the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose country was involved in bombing Libya. And you wrote, and I'm quoting you, I felt that the mindset in London and Paris didn't have openings for really reflecting on the diplomatic option. Then you also described the Western policymakers' deliberations while discussing Gaddafi's fate. And as you wrote, and I'm again quoting you, in the UK, Defense Secretary Liam Fox said that Gaddafi could potentially be targeted, while Chief of Defense Staff Richards said absolutely not, whereupon Prime Minister Cameron reproached Richards along the lines of, you do the fightings, I will do the talking, end quote. Meanwhile, on March 10th, 2011, President Sarkozy met with representative from the National Transitional Council, the NTC. That body was recognized that day as the legitimate representative of the Libyan people, while the GCC's countries followed suit, regardless of those who led the military intervention had the interest of the Libyan people at heart. To what extent did these unilateral initiatives impact other mediating initiatives such as the African Union efforts of mediation led by South Africa? And in other words, why did, for example, African Union proposal of solving the Libyan crisis fail to take ground between Gaddafi's regime and the NTC? In chapter 3 of your book, you pointed out, and I am quoting you, an angry Jacob Zuma, who was president of South Africa from 2009 to 2018, told the Security Council in September that the African Union initiative to ensure a political rather than a military solution to the Libyan crisis was deliberately undermined despite the decision and resolution 1973 to support the African Union roadmap. So there was a kind of sabotage from those powers leading the airstrike campaign on Libya to undermine any diplomatic initiative coming from regional organizations such as the African Union. And Libya is one of the founding of the African Union.
Yes, I mean, as you've clearly read, I devote a whole chapter to sort of tracing the mediation efforts. There was a United Nations special envoy. I of course knew him and was working in parallel with him. He was genuinely seeking a mediated end. The members of the Security Council said they supported his efforts, but in truth, the leading intervening countries, France and the UK, I don't believe genuinely supported his efforts. The African Union from the beginning wanted to negotiate an outcome. One of the problems was that some people, including some Libyans, including in the National Transitional Council, believed that the African Union were more interested in saving Gaddafi rather than negotiating his exit. I think that's a misreading. I think the African Union genuinely saw the need for Gaddafi to be negotiated out of his position of power, at least, if not out of Libya. But that wasn't I mean, because of Gaddafi's the nature of his own involvement with Africa, which was very much resented by many Libyans because he had squandered a lot of Libyan resources on his sort of African aspirations and adventures. So the African Union was not well accepted by many Libyans, but I believe the African Union was genuine in its mediation efforts. Norway, which tried, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs you quote is today the Prime Minister of Norway, in fact, and I think Norway made a genuine attempt, and what he says about the lack of real interest on the part of UK and France, I think is also correct. There was a point at which they were willing to see negotiations that sort of eased Gaddafi out, and they looked for places where he might go into exile, including, Equatorial Guinea, because it wasn't a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But except when the military effort for a while seemed a bit deadlocked, there wasn't a genuine interest in a mediated outcome. Having said all that, one also has to say that Gaddafi himself never really offered any kind of an olive branch that suggested that he was open to that. And efforts were made by those around him, perhaps even by Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, his son, who did perhaps have an interest in seeing a negotiated outcome. But there never really seems to be a moment when Gaddafi himself was open to that. And his own rhetoric helped bring about his downfall, because he continued in persistently denouncing the rebels as traitors and rats, not a moment of offering an olive branch towards negotiations. And of course, on the other side, the National Transitional Council, the more the conflict goes on, as happens, we can see it in Ukraine today. I mean, the more people die, the longer a conflict goes on, the harder it is to say that there should be some kind of settlement after blood has been shed. So there was very little willingness on the part of the National Transitional Council, especially because they felt they had the backing of the UK, France, and NATO for military victory, and therefore very little incentive to negotiate. Could there have been a mediated outcome? I think that's an impossible question to answer, but I think the best chance of it would have been if the African Union, which had the access to Gaddafi, put the maximum pressure on him, and if the UK and France, as the leading interveners, had encouraged the NTC rather than promised the military victory. But that's not what happened.
Yeah. In the meantime, other actors in the region, regional actors such as the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Jordan, I think they play a role in acting militarily outside the NATO institutional framework and enabled the rebel groups to overthrow Gaddafi's regime by sending military shipments to them in total disregard to the UN arms embargo on Libya that the NATO was supposed to enforce. How did their involvement impact like the whole crisis in Libya? And you wrote about that in your book.
Yeah, I think firstly, sometimes, and maybe we've been doing this a bit ourselves, I mean, because Cameron and Sarkozy were so much in the lead early on, one can sometimes underestimate how important the pressure from the Arab world for intervention in Libya was. And I tracked that in the book. And it wasn't just, it wasn't even just governments like Qatar, although Qatar was certainly in the lead. It was Arab civil society as well. I mean, the initial calls for a no-fly zone or for some kind of intervention were very strong. And again, sometimes now Libya is taken out of the overall context of the so-called Arab Spring, where one has to see it in that wider context. So that was important early on. Then Qatar and the UAE and Jordan actually participated inside the NATO operation, but also outside it bilaterally. And something I tried to piece together in the book, only from open sources, but it's still not very much written about, is both the arms supplies and the special forces on the ground. Now it's on the public record. David Cameron writes in his memoir of how they set up a secret cell in Paris with what he called the Four Amigos, France, the UK, Qatar, and the UAE, which is a bit ironic given what kind of amigos some of them are today. But there was a coordinated special forces operation, arms supplies, which the UK and mostly France, and the US preferred to be through Qatar and the UAE rather than directly. And that was extremely important. I mean, again, it's often talked about just as a no-fly zone, just as a NATO operation. Actually, the ground war and the support to the rebel forces on the ground, but the actual presence of special forces, not perhaps fighting, but doing a great deal of training and mentoring and supplying, was very significant in how the war actually unfolded. Now then, where some of the lasting consequences come in is that there wasn't a real chain of command from the civilian leadership of the National Transitional Council to the different armed groups, particularly to those in the West that were a long way away from the seat of Ghazi. And so those weapons supplies went direct, and increasingly they went direct to those with whom the different countries preferred to have their links, so that the weapons supplied by Qatar tended to go to the more Islamist of the armed groups. The weapons from the UAE went in particular to Zintan, and so you began to get some of the tensions between armed groups and their supporters that would become increasingly significant in Libya later on. So that had real lasting consequences.
Now, moving to your tenure as the head of the UNSMIL, and as you know, experts and practitioners of the post-conflict state building often say that conflict is an opportunity to build better. So what were some of the major challenges that UN engagement in post-conflict Libya through the UNSMIL under your leadership, of course, faced while dealing with the first transitional government? Here I'm thinking about the process of the DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, the proliferation of armed groups. Reportedly that the NTC's Warrior Affairs Commission identified more than 160,000 fighters who allegedly got involved in the armed uprisings, the transitional justice, the first legislative elections. So that's your experience during your first year, and what's your assessment of that?
Well, you talk about build back better. The problem with Libya in many ways was nothing to build back. I mean, the absence of a real state. I mean, apart from the central bank and the national oil company, otherwise Gaddafi had, consciously not developed the normal institutions of a modern state. So there was a huge state building task. There still is a big state building task for Libya. And in that first period, the National Transitional Council, and the first interim government that it created, they regarded themselves as having only a very limited mandate to deliver an election and the basis for a further government. And really, that was not only their view, that was very much the view of Libyans. They were their authority was acknowledged on an interim basis, but they were not regarded as a government that before an election would have the authority, for example, to get the armed groups to stand down. I think one also has to say that the situation Libya faced again was at that stage almost unique with these fragmented armed groups. One talks about DDR. Normally, one is talking about integrating maybe one rebel army or a couple of rebel armed groups into an existing state army. Well, first, by the end of the conflict, you didn't have an existing state army. You hadn't had much of one at the beginning of the conflict, because Gaddafi depended much more on the revolutionary battalions under his sons that were not really part of a normal state army. So you didn't have a state army to integrate groups into. And on the other hand, you didn't have a single rebel army. You had an extremely fragmented set of armed groups. Frankly, the international community isn't very good at DDR, even in much more straightforward contexts than that presented itself, and there really, wasn't a great deal of experience to draw on as to how that should be addressed. Where I think the responsibility rests again is with the countries that help build up those armed groups. So we're back to, the UK, France, Qatar, the UAE. They had built up those armed groups, and I do argue in the book, had a responsibility to then try to help future Libyan authorities to get them to stand down. But that didn't happen, and before long, what one had was other external actors coming in and supporting different elements of the armed groups across the Libyan scene, and that's what we're faced with still today.
So, I want to go back to the first elections that you mentioned in the beginning of your talk. Was the first election held too soon before building a reliable institution, and what went wrong afterwards? Means what has to go first, building state institutions at many levels in Libya, or just go to the elections and then whoever won those elections will be tasked with building those institutions? Just, I say it in a very simplistic way.
Yeah. Well, again, there's a whole literature around, post-conflict elections and arguments that they shouldn't be held too soon. My own view, firstly, I think that's a very situation-specific question, and I don't think generalizations across different post-conflict contexts make much sense, personally. And what it depends on critically, you can postpone an election if you have transitional authorities who are well accepted and have an adequate degree of authority. You didn't have that in Libya. On the contrary, firstly, the Libyans, sometimes people talk as if it was the international community that pushed Libya into elections. That was far from the case. The decision to go for early elections was a Libyan decision taken after a major debate about the post-conflict roadmap in Benghazi in August 2011. It wasn't something that those international actors on the ground pushed. But you couldn't say, so Libyans were determined to have elections. They've been denied elections by Gaddafi for 40 years. And the insistence that there must be elections, they went ahead and held elections, local elections in Misrata, in Benghazi, without any international encouragement or even support. There was an absolute determination that there must be elections. And I don't even disagree with it, because there wasn't, because as I just said earlier, the National Transitional Council, the first interim government, was not regarded by itself, by other Libyans, as having authority until there was a basis of legitimacy in elections. So in my view at the time, my retrospective view too, there was really not an alternative to going ahead with elections. People now say, my distinguished successor as Special Representative Tariq Mitri has written about this, and he says, no, security should have been created first. But how do you create security if you don't have authorities who have some accepted legitimacy? And you didn't have that. The hope was that an election could create the basis for that. Sadly, it didn't.
So here again, given your experience with the UNSMIL, are there any parallel, or I would say, lessons you may draw from the critical role played by one of great diplomats who played a key role in the unification in the process of establishing the Libyan state? And here I am referring to the UN High Commissioner for Libya, Adrian Pelt, worked hard from 1949 to 1952 to lead the country toward independence. I'm sure you are familiar with his excellent and very detailed manuscript. It's more than 1,000 pages, Libyan Independence and the United Nations, a case planned decolonization, which with the foreword of the preface of the late UN Secretary General U Thant, and was published in the 1970s. So I'm sure before going there, like you went through that book.
Well, yeah. First I should say that I myself, I don't think there's hardly any awareness, even still at the United Nations in 2011, that the UN had even played the role it had played in putting together the Kingdom of Libya in the first place. And but I certainly didn't have that. And I remember, telling the then Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, a little bit about it after I started learning about it. And I hope you might play your students the video clip that shows Adrian Pelt in Libya in 1950. One of the consequences of that was it did mean that Libya was probably more open to a UN role in 2011 than other countries in the Arab world would have been, because that was seen as a very positive role that the United Nations had played in 1950-51. And Adrian Pelt was much honoured. There were streets named after him in Tripoli and Benghazi. And I was embarrassed when, people said, you're the next Adrian Pelt. Well, I mean, I think the truth is that there's really no analogy between the situation then and the situation in 2011, because that UN Commission did a very good job of putting together a country that was left at the end of the Second World War with just about nothing, a lot of scrap metal and a couple of US and UK bases as the only income from the country. Very, very different from post-Gaddafi Libya, where the centrality of oil riches became an absolutely crucial political issue at the center of the state. So I think it's fascinating history, and I'd encourage anyone to read it. I don't, to be honest, think that history tells us a great deal about what the UN can do in relation to Libya today.
And for the audience, I would say Pellet means struggled with France and Britain to assert his authority, because it wasn't easy for him dealing with those two powers on the Libyan dossier. Yeah. So
yes, and the other external interests were all there. Egypt, Turkey. I mean, that's it had its own geopolitics at the time. Yeah,
true. So my last question before opening up to the audience: what's your assessment of the international role in Libya, and your reassessment 1 decade after the NATO-led military intervention, which I think, turned Libya into a protracted and failed experiment in the middle of the Mediterranean?
Well, I'd take issue with turned Libya into that. I mean, the way I look at Libya is the legacy of Gaddafi was going to be a terrible legacy. And it's not even just the legacy of Gaddafi, it's the whole of Libya's history. The fact that it never had a period of successful institution building to allow it to become, a modern state, let alone a democratic state. And the other thing that I constantly have to remind people, and here's the difference with Iraq. I mean, you rightly say that I was strongly opposed to the invasion of Iraq. Well, that was a completely gratuitous decision by George Bush, supported by Tony Blair. It wasn't actually that the West decided to overthrow Gaddafi. I mean, a large section of the Libyan people, in the context of the Arab Spring, encouraged by events that had rapidly seen the downfall of Ben Ali and Mubarak, they decided they weren't going to put up with Gaddafi any longer. And then Gaddafi's response to that posed issues for the external actors as to how they should respond. So I'm afraid Libya faced a very difficult post-Gaddafi future whenever and however that post-Gaddafi situation had come about. I think the tragedy now is that Libyans are not being allowed to work out that future for themselves, because the involvement of external actors has become so great that Libyans, are being not allowed by those actors, and indeed by their own elites that are happily drawing on the support of those actors to determine their future. But I don't think one can analyze the tragedy only from the point at which the NATO intervention began. I think one has to recognize what 40 years of Gaddafi left and the extent to which that left very bitter opposition to him and his rule to explode into what occurred in 2011.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let us move to the questions. We still have perhaps 15 minutes for the questions. This plan, yeah, there are many. So Yeah, would Mr. Martin comment on Gaddafi's gold dinar and his plans to sell Libyan oil for gold and not for dollars as the real basis of his removal from power? That's first question.
I think the questioner must know more about that issue than I do. The only thing I'm pretty certain is it wasn't the real reason for him being ousted from power. There are all kinds of issues raised as to what the real motives may have been of the intervening countries. I mean, I really do believe that the intervention was a response to the crushing of demonstrators. I don't believe that it was a calculated intervention for economic reasons. On the contrary, I mean, the Western countries were perfectly happy with Gaddafi once he'd got rid of his nuclear, his aspiration for nuclear weapons. They were very happily collaborating with him in counter-terrorism operations as they saw them. You know, Tony Blair wanted a photo shoot with Gaddafi in his tent when he visited and continued to visit after he was prime minister, pursuing, whatever interests of his clients. Sarkozy, we still don't know the outcome of judicial proceedings in France as to what did or didn't happen in terms of contributions. Berlusconi, I mean, it's not the case that the West was motivated to get rid of Gaddafi. They were confronted with a situation when a large section of Libyans decided they wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. Of course, before long, they had their eyes on what are going to be the economic opportunities in, post-Gaddafi Libya. And of course, by then, you saw interests from countries that had contracts that would want to revive them in new Libya or saw new opportunities. So I'm not saying there were no economic issues as things got underway. But I don't believe that, or I've been unable to find any evidence, particularly in relation to France and UK, who were the key decision makers, let alone in the US, because one of the other things that is quite striking, I think, when people examine it, and there is a tendency in the US to think that the US is the major player in given situations. Obama was really reluctant to get involved in Libya. I quote him telling Gates that it was a 51-49 decision for him, and whatever one thinks of his eventual decision to go with the intervention, his decision-making process was a lot more considered and a lot more marginal in his decision than the way that Cameron Sarkozy decided to intervene. So I haven't found motives other than the initial protection of civilians motives.
But oil is not a major factor in this war at all. From your investigation, from your. No.
Not in starting it. I mean, in terms of later interests, of course, it became an issue, but not in the original decision making that was very rapid crisis response decision making in a context where crises were all over the region at the time, and we sometimes don't remember that when we take Libya and look at it on its own, rather than looking at it in terms of what was going on in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, etc.
Yeah. So there's another question. Thank you for your very thoughtful and refreshing, well-informed and well-crafted comments. What advice do you have for the new, Secretary General based on your book? And how do you feel about the current debate over holding elections, which most young Libyans want, and power sharing, which many of the older generation seems to prefer?
I guess that's my advice to the new special representative of the Secretary General rather than the Secretary General.
I didn't read the acronym well, yeah.
I do absolutely think that Libya, again, does need to have elections, because there is really no residual legitimacy in the actors today. And indeed, it was clear from the response to the registration before the elections that were to be held in December that demand is very clearly there. It was also there in demonstrations more recently. The problem is agreeing on the framework for those elections. And again, it's not the technical issues of elections. Libyans showed in 2012 that they're very well capable of running an election. I think the biggest issue is what happens if you have a presidential election rather than a parliamentary election. Because when Libya, the decision that was taken was to have simultaneous presidential and parliamentary elections, and then the House of Representatives wanted to have the presidential election first, when there wasn't really even a constitutional definition of the powers of the presidency. And the problem with a presidential election is, is there a candidate who can emerge from that, who is likely to be able to unify East, West, South? And it was very clear heading to December last year that there wasn't such a candidate. And I think that's still a big risk. If you have a parliamentary election, then certainly all parts of the country gets represented, and somehow they have to agree on the prime minister. In a sense, they have to agree on power sharing, but power sharing on a more democratic basis rather than just a carve up amongst existing actors. I fear that the consequence of a presidential election, if it really is to be of an executive president who's then to be the strong man, and they've only been men available, that could just be the basis of further divisions, because it's very unlikely that any one of the main candidates who put themselves forward would be able to command support across the country. But parliamentary elections, I think, are absolutely necessary to provide the legitimacy for a new government and to complete a constitutional process.
Another question. Thank you for the fascinating presentation and thoughtful discussion. You mentioned earlier that in retrospect, the threat of genocide was exaggerated and played a role in animating support in the West, particularly for an intervention. Is it possible to imagine an intervention in Libya without certain ideas of responsibility to protect underpinning the UNSC resolutions? Relatedly, can you discuss some more about the role of the Libya intervention in exposing certain paradoxes and problems inherent to this doctrine?
Well, there's an extremely good article which I footnote and recommend, addressing the real dilemmas in responsibility to protect in this context by Roland Paris, the Canadian professor, and I really bow to that analysis. Responsibility to protect is not just about genocide. There was a real issue of protection against war crimes and crimes against humanity, not, in my view, protection against genocide, because that genocide wasn't happening, and I don't believe even if Gaddafi had retaken Benghazi, it would have been genocide. But that doesn't mean that there was no basis for a protection of civilians mandate. But as I said earlier, I don't think that really came about because of the acceptance of a doctrine by the General Assembly of responsibility to protect. I think it did come about in part because key decision makers were very much influenced by the criticism of the failure to intervene in Rwanda and Bosnia. And, Paul Kagame of Rwanda was one of those who spoke in favor of intervention. And the very same Norwegian then foreign minister, now prime minister, himself testified to a kind of generation of politicians who, because they carried the burden of what had happened in Rwanda and Bosnia, would have found it very hard to stand aside when Gaddafi forces retook Benghazi and, did what we can best project they might have done on the ground. And as I say, I don't believe it would have been genocide, but I do believe that that it would have been very nasty in Benghazi and elsewhere. The alternative at that point was not going back to some relatively peaceful Libya, run by Gaddafi's repression and handing out of the oil wealth. By that point, the genie was out of the bottle. And I think if there had been no intervention, I think there probably would have been a prolonged internal civil war. It would have gone more in the direction of Syria, if you like, because I don't think Gaddafi would easily have reasserted control over the east or over towns in the west. So there was not a kind of there was not an option once the uprising had happened of things just settling back into how Libya had been in 2010, and that too goes to the whole environment of the uprisings across the Arab world at that time.
So another question. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Why do you think Gaddafi failed to build modern institutions in Libya?
I mean, Gaddafi was ideologically opposed, and his ideology was all his own. But his ideology was that he wasn't the head of government. He was the leader of the people. Libya, according to him, was simply run by the people through their popular assemblies. In reality, it was run in a highly centralized and highly repressive way by Gaddafi's state security institutions. But what it wasn't was a well-developed state. When I saw the first ministers in the interim government in their ministries, they had inherited ministries that were hugely overstaffed in terms of the number of people on the payroll, but most of whom were on the payroll to do nothing or next to nothing. It was a way of, the oil wealth that's there is a way of keeping people happy. They weren't really expected to do anything. So these ministers were at the top of ministries, but they had no levers to pull in terms of giving instructions to a bureaucracy that was sufficiently professional and capable. I may be caricaturing a bit, but that was basically the situation, and it was because Gaddafi had been consciously opposed to developing institutions on don't just say a Western model, any conventional model, and in that sense, Libya. There was a lot that was in common about the motivation of uprisings in different Arab countries, but the context they then dealt with was radically different according to whether you had a state, you had an army, you had a civil society. So, in Egypt, you had an army. In Tunisia, you had a civil society. In Libya, you didn't have a real army. You didn't have anything that had been allowed to develop as a civil society, and you didn't have much of a state.
Yeah, I wonder, we're running out of time. Any final thought or conclusion, or I would say concluding reflection? You are the first head of the UNSMIL in Libya a decade ago, or I would say, where do you situate your short experience in Libya in this whole process? That, again, I think, unfortunately seems taking the country toward a long-standing political stalemate.
Well, obviously, to me, what's happened in Libya is tragic, and but if there's hope, it requires, first of all, it requires greater responsibility in terms of the external actors, and the external actors to recognize that they need to encourage Libyans to come together rather than act in ways that entrench divisions. And secondly, it requires the Libyans to have enough of a sense of national responsibility. My best hope for Libya still lies in the kind of people who emerged as civil society actors, some of whom are still very active on the ground. And what I like to think is that if at some point the political actors and the regional actors allow a path forward, you know, there are a lot of Libyans who have reflected a lot and learnt a lot in the period since 2011 who are there to build a different kind of Libya, and a democratic Libya, and a Libya that's a human rights respecting country. I hope to see that, but it's not where we are tomorrow.
Yeah, on that positive note, I would like to thank, on behalf of the CCAS and all the attendees this evening, Ian Martin for sharing his critical insight on this experience in Libya, a Mediterranean country with the longest coastline in the region, more than 1,100 miles, an Arab country and an African country. Thus, Libya is instrumental to these three regional systems, which with the international peace efforts and the right and accountable, I think what we need, right and accountable leadership willing to serve Libyan people in the first place rather than serving themselves. Libyan, I am hopeful. I have a lot of hope about that, and I think Libyans can play a constructive role in overcoming many of the factors behind the transitional stale process that the country is experiencing now. Thank you very much, Ian Martin, and again, your great book is a must-read for those who are interested in Libya and want to understand what's going on in this country since 2011. Thank you very much for your time and for coming to us here at the CCAS, though remotely, and I hope next time you will be able to visit us here. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.